The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Cincinnati courthouse as Detective Sarah Mills stood outside, her hand resting on the warm fur of her German Shepherd partner, Baron. The dog was alert, his ears perked up at the sound of the busy city traffic, but his demeanor remained calm and composed. Sarah glanced down at her watch. 9:47 a.m. They had 13 minutes before she needed to be inside, and her stomach was churning with a mixture of anxiety and uncertainty. She had never brought Baron into a courtroom before, and the thought of doing so today, in such a sensitive case, made her palms sweat. The reason for their unexpected appearance at the courthouse was far from ideal. Sarah's sister, who usually watched her 12-year-old nephew on days when Sarah couldn't arrange proper K-9 care, had texted her at 6 a.m. that morning. Her daughter had come down with a high fever, and she couldn't possibly watch another child. Sarah had immediately scrambled through her contacts, calling every dog daycare facility in a 20-mile radius, but it was a Tuesday morning, and every single one was fully booked. In desperation, she had called her lieutenant, explaining the situation. To her surprise, he had given her permission to bring Baron along, with strict instructions to keep him outside the courtroom unless absolutely necessary. But now, as she stood here, Sarah found herself reconsidering that decision. The courthouse was a solemn, formal place, not exactly the ideal environment for a working police dog. Baron was trained for narcotics detection, search and rescue, and suspect apprehension, but he had also undergone extensive socialization training. He was calm around people, responsive to commands, and had a gentle temperament that Sarah had seen comfort numerous traumatized victims over their 5 years working together. Still, bringing him inside felt like crossing some invisible line of propriety. Inside the building, a different kind of anxiety was unfolding in the courtroom. 3-year-old Emma Carlson was being escorted down the hallway by a court-appointed guardian ad litem, a woman named Susan Matthews who specialized in child welfare cases. Emma's small hand gripped Susan's finger as they walked, and her other hand clutched her most prized possession, a worn teddy bear with one ear slightly torn from years of sleeping beside her. The bear had a name, Mr. Buttons, and Emma rarely let it out of her sight. The child was dressed in her best outfit, a small pink dress with white lace trim that her mother had carefully selected. But the dress did nothing to hide the fact that Emma was absolutely terrified. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying that morning. She hadn't slept well the night before, and the dark circles under her eyes made her look far older than 3. As they approached the courtroom doors, Susan knelt down and spoke to her softly. "Emma, sweetheart, we're going to go into a big room now. There are going to be a lot of adults in there, and they're going to be talking about you and your family. It's okay to feel scared. Just remember I'm right here with you, and everyone in that room cares about you very much. Can you be brave for me?" Emma nodded slowly, though her grip on Mr. Buttons tightened to the point where the stuffed animal seemed strained slightly. She didn't fully understand what was happening, only that her parents had been arguing a lot lately, and now there were lawyers and judges and important people making decisions about where she would live. All she wanted was for things to go back to normal, back to before the yelling started. In the courtroom, Michael Carlson sat at one table with his attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Rachel Hoffman who had built her reputation on winning custody battles, no matter what it took. Michael was a handsome man in his mid-30s, with dark hair and tired eyes. He wore an expensive suit, the kind he'd never worn before the divorce proceedings began. His hands were clasped tightly on the table in front of him, and his jaw was clenched so hard that the muscles stood out visibly. Across the room sat his ex-wife's representative, not the ex-wife herself, but Patricia Monroe, Michael's new fiancée. The tension between these two women was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Patricia had become the focal point of Michael's argument against giving full custody to his ex-wife. He claimed that Patricia was a stabilizing influence, a woman who wanted to help raise Emma as her own child. What he didn't mention, though the court had uncovered it through investigation, was that Patricia had a history of volatile relationships, and that she had once made a snide comment to Michael about Emma being a burden during their first month of dating. Judge Patricia Henderson sat at the bench, reviewing her notes one final time before the proceedings began. She was a woman in her late 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp eyes that had seen every trick, every manipulation, every desperate argument that desperate parents could throw at her. She had been on the bench for 17 years, presiding over 300 custody cases, and they all blurred together after a while. But this one felt different. This one felt uglier, more bitter, more fundamentally broken than most. The judge had read through the depositions, the accusations, the counter-accusations. Michael claimed that his ex-wife, Catherine, was unstable and unable to provide a proper home for Emma. Catherine, in turn, claimed that Michael was more interested in his new relationship than in his daughter's well-being, and that Patricia was a toxic influence who didn't have Emma's best interests at heart. Both parents had spent thousands of dollars on lawyers and expert witnesses, all fighting for the right to claim Emma as their primary custodian. What struck Judge Henderson most profoundly was that neither parent seemed to have stopped, even once during these 9 months of legal warfare, to think about what Emma actually needed. They had become so consumed with winning against each other that their daughter had become nothing more than a trophy to be fought over. The judge had seen this pattern too many times before, and it never failed to break her heart a little bit. As the bailiff checked his watch and prepared to call the court to order, Emma was being led through the doors. She looked impossibly small in this cavernous room, with its high ceilings and imposing wooden furniture. The moment she saw her father, she reached out her small arms toward him, but Susan gently held her back, guiding her instead to a specially prepared chair at the front of the room where she would be visible to everyone but insulated somewhat from the intensity of the proceedings. Michael's eyes welled with tears seeing his daughter, but he quickly composed himself, remembering his lawyer's instructions not to show excessive emotion. Catherine, who had been waiting in a separate room, was brought in through a side door, and she immediately locked eyes with her daughter. Emma's face brightened slightly, recognizing her mother, but the brightness quickly faded as she sensed the tension in the room. Outside, Sarah was adjusting Barron's lead and taking a deep breath. She had no idea that within the next few minutes, she would be called upon to bring her partner into that courtroom. She had no idea that what was about to happen would change the course of this family's history forever. Judge Patricia Henderson had been presiding over custody cases for 17 years, and in that time, she had learned to read people with the precision of a master chess player. She could spot a lie from across the courtroom, could detect the subtle shift in someone's voice when they were about to say something they didn't truly believe. She had seen fathers cry real tears and fathers cry fake tears. She had witnessed mothers fight with the ferocity of tigers and mothers fight with the exhaustion of resignation. By now, she thought she had seen every variation of human conflict that could be wrapped in a custody dispute. But this case, the Carlson case, was proving to be something different altogether. The morning session had been brutal. Rachel Hoffman, Michael's attorney, had presented her arguments with surgical precision. She spoke about Michael's stable job as a software engineer, his new commitment to family life with Patricia, his desire to provide a structured and predictable home for Emma. She painted a picture of a man who had made mistakes, but was now determined to be the father his daughter needed. The argument was compelling, well-researched, and buttressed with expert testimony from a child psychologist who claimed that children thrive best with consistent male role models in their lives. Then came Catherine's attorney, a man named David Chen who had a reputation for being equally formidable in the courtroom. He systematically dismantled Hoffman's arguments, presenting evidence of Michael's late child support payments, his tendency to reschedule visits at the last minute, and most damaging of all, texts between Michael and Patricia discussing how difficult it was to have Emma around on certain weekends. David painted a picture of a man more interested in his new relationship than in his daughter's well-being. The arguments went back and forth, ping-ponging across the courtroom with the precision of a professional tennis match. Facts were presented, counterfacts were introduced. Expert witnesses testified about attachment theory, about the importance of maternal bonds, about the benefits of paternal involvement. The courtroom had become a battleground, and little Emma Carlson was the prize that both sides were determined to claim. But here was the thing that troubled Judge Henderson more than anything else. Neither lawyer, neither expert witness, neither parent had once asked what Emma actually wanted. They had discussed her as if she were an object, a possession to be divided fairly between two competing claims. The judge had read through psychological evaluations, medical records, and financial statements, but nowhere in all of that documentation was there a genuine understanding of Emma as a person. When the court took its mid-morning recess, Judge Henderson retired to her private chambers and asked her bailiff to bring her a cup of coffee. She was exhausted, and it wasn't even noon yet. She sat at her desk, rubbing her temples, thinking about the cases she had presided over in the past, the children whose lives had been altered by her decisions. Some of them had turned out fine, adjusting to their new custody arrangements, building good relationships with both parents. Others had been damaged by the process, caught in the middle of parental warfare that continued long after the court papers were signed. She was pulled from her thoughts by a knock on the door. It was her bailiff, a man named George who had worked in the courthouse for longer than she had been a judge. "Judge, your coffee," he said, setting the cup on her desk. "How are you holding up with this one?" Judge Henderson looked at him, and something in her expression must have betrayed her frustration because George immediately understood. "Rough case?" he asked sympathetically. "The roughest," she admitted. "These parents have lost sight of everything that matters. They're so focused on destroying each other that they've completely forgotten about their daughter." George nodded knowingly. He had seen it many times before. What you need is something to shake things up, to remind them what this is really about. The judge was about to respond when George continued. "By the way, there's a police officer outside in the hallway with a German Shepherd, Detective Sarah Mills. Apparently, her regular childcare fell through, so the lieutenant gave her permission to bring her K-9 partner along. The dog seems very well behaved." Something in Judge Henderson's mind clicked. She leaned back in her chair, considering the idea. It was unconventional, possibly even inappropriate by strict courtroom standards. But then again, this entire case had been inappropriate in its own way. Two parents so consumed with winning that they couldn't see their own child clearly. She had read studies about the therapeutic effects of animals on traumatized children. Therapy dogs were used in hospitals, in schools, in shelters. There was solid science behind the idea that a calm animal could help reduce anxiety and open emotional pathways that were otherwise blocked by fear. Judge Henderson made a decision that would later be discussed by legal scholars and child psychologists alike. It was a decision that went against conventional courtroom protocol, that bent the rules in ways that no one had anticipated. But it was also a decision born from compassion and a deep understanding that sometimes the most important moments in a trial happen not when facts are presented, but when hearts are opened. "George," she said, sitting forward with renewed energy, "bring Detective Mills and her dog to my chambers. I want to speak with her." Within 10 minutes, Sarah Mills was standing nervously in Judge Henderson's chambers, Barron sitting calmly at her side. The judge studied the dog carefully, his alert but gentle eyes, his calm demeanor, the way he responded immediately to Sarah's subtle hand signals. Barron was clearly a well-trained animal, disciplined but not aggressive, alert but not anxious. "Detective Mills," Judge Henderson began, "I'm about to make an unusual request, and I want you to feel completely comfortable declining if you're not comfortable with it." Sarah's heart had begun to race the moment she was called to the judge's chambers. She had no idea what the judge wanted, and her mind was racing through possibilities, none of them good. "Your dog," Judge Henderson continued, appears to be exceptionally calm and well-trained. I have a 3-year-old child in my courtroom today who is extremely anxious and frightened. A custody battle between her parents has made her feel unsafe and confused. I would like to bring Barron into the courtroom, not as evidence or as part of the legal proceedings, but simply as a calming presence. I believe your dog might help this child feel less afraid. What do you think?" Sarah was stunned. She had expected anything except this. Bringing Barron into an active courtroom was completely outside the realm of normal protocol. But as she looked at Judge Henderson's face, she saw someone who understood something fundamental about what this case really needed. "Your Honor," Sarah said carefully, "Barron is trained for public settings and he's remarkably calm around children. But I want to be honest, I've never done anything quite like this before." "Neither have I," Judge Henderson admitted. "Which is exactly why I think it might work. Sometimes protocol serves the system more than it serves justice. In this case, I believe Emma needs something that no lawyer, no expert witness, and no fact-based argument can provide. She needs to see that the world contains something safe, something kind, something that exists outside of her parents' conflict. Your dog can represent that." Sarah looked down at Barron, who gazed back at her with his characteristic calm. She thought about the victims she had comforted with him over the years, the way his presence seemed to dissolve fear and create space for healing. "When would you like us to come in?" Sarah asked. Judge Henderson smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed all morning. "After lunch. Give everyone time to digest the morning's arguments. And Detective Mills, thank you. I have a feeling this is going to matter more than you realize." As Sarah and Barron left the judge's chambers, neither of them knew that they were about to become the most important witnesses in this entire case. The evidence wouldn't come from documents or testimony. It would come from a 3-year-old girl's reaction to a dog, and what that reaction would reveal about what Emma truly needed. The courtroom doors swung open at precisely 1:15 p.m. after the lunch recess. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows at a different angle than it had in the morning, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Most of the courtroom's occupants had settled back into their seats, the lawyers reviewing their notes, the court stenographer preparing her equipment, the bailiff standing at attention. Emma had been led back into the room by Susan Matthews, and she was visibly more anxious than she had been before lunch. The break had given her too much time to think, too much time to worry about what would happen next. Michael sat rigidly at his table, his jaw working as if he were chewing on something bitter. Patricia sat beside him, her fingers drumming impatiently on the table. Across the room, Catherine sat with David Chen, her attorney, both of them engaged in quiet conversation. Judge Henderson had taken her seat at the bench and was reviewing her notes, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Then the doors opened again, and Detective Sarah Mills walked in, Barron at her side. The effect was immediate and palpable. The entire courtroom seemed to pause, as if everyone had collectively held their breath. Eyes turned toward the dog, and whispers began to ripple through the room. What was a police dog doing in a custody hearing? This was highly irregular, unprecedented, possibly even grounds for appeal based on improper courtroom conduct. Rachel Hoffman, Michael's attorney, immediately stood up. "Your Honor, I object to the presence of this animal in the courtroom. This is highly inappropriate and could prejudice the proceedings." But Judge Henderson cut her off with a single look. "The animal is here at my direction, and its presence is for therapeutic purposes only. It is not evidence. It is not a witness. It is a calming influence for a frightened child. If anyone has a problem with that, we can discuss it in my chambers after this session. For now, please be seated." There was a murmur of discontent, but no one dared to challenge the judge further. Sarah walked Barron down the center aisle of the courtroom, acutely aware that every eye in the room was now fixed on her and her partner. Her heart was pounding in her chest. This was the moment that would either vindicate Judge Henderson's unconventional decision or confirm every skeptic's worst fears about allowing animals into formal legal proceedings. But then something happened that changed everything. Emma's head, which had been bowed down toward her lap, suddenly snapped up. Her eyes, which had been red and tired all morning, suddenly widened with an intensity that hadn't been there before. She watched as Baron walked past her chair, his massive form moving with surprising grace for such a large animal. The dog was easily 3 times her size, and Emma's initial reaction should have been fear. Instead, what crossed her small face was wonder. Baron, who had been trained not to approach people without explicit permission, maintained his calm demeanor as Sarah guided him to a position slightly behind and to the side of Emma's chair. The dog understood his role perfectly. He knew, through years of training and through something deeper, some instinctual knowledge of what this small human needed, that he should be present but not intrusive, available but not demanding. Emma's eyes never left Baron. She watched him settle onto the floor, his large body folding in on itself with an almost graceful precision. When the dog yawned, opening his massive mouth wide before closing it with a soft click, Emma's lips curved upward into a smile. It was a small smile, barely noticeable to anyone not paying close attention, but it was genuine. It was the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her since she'd entered the courthouse that morning. Michael felt something shift in his chest as he watched his daughter smile. He had been so focused on winning, on proving his case, on defeating Catherine and Patricia's accusations, that he hadn't actually looked at Emma in days. Not really looked at her. Now, seeing her face soften as she watched Baron, he was struck by how young she was, how small, how utterly vulnerable. She was 3 years old, and she was caught in the middle of a war between adults who were supposed to love her. Patricia, sitting beside Michael, noticed his change in demeanor. For the first time since this whole custody battle had begun, she saw something in her fiancé's face that made her uncomfortable. She saw genuine love and concern for his daughter. And in that moment, she realized that she had become a symbol of something Michael had lost, his connection to Emma. She had encouraged him to fight harder, to present himself as the better option, to prove that he could be a good father. But sitting here now, watching Emma smile at a dog, Patricia had to ask herself, what was the point of all this fighting if Michael had already lost touch with his daughter in the process? Catherine watched her daughter with a different kind of intensity. She had been so angry, so betrayed, so desperate to prove that Michael was an unfit father, that she had almost forgotten why she wanted custody in the first place. She had wanted to protect Emma, to give her a safe and loving home. But had Catherine herself been present? Had she been truly available to her daughter, or had she been so consumed with the legal battle that she had forgotten to simply be a mother? Baron shifted slightly, and Emma's eyes followed his every movement. When the dog's tail began to wag slowly, not frantically, but with a gentle, measured rhythm, Emma's breathing seemed to synchronize with that tail. Her shoulders, which had been tense and hunched up near her ears, began to relax. Her grip on Mr. Buttons, her teddy bear, loosened slightly. The worn fabric of the bear's ear, which had been clenched in her tight fist, finally had a chance to breathe. Judge Henderson watched all of this from her elevated position at the bench. She had studied child psychology, family law, and courtroom procedure for decades, but what she was witnessing now was something that no textbook could fully capture. She was watching a small child's nervous system shift from a state of anxiety and threat to a state of calm and safety. She was watching the power of a single, kind presence to dissolve years of conflict and fear. Sarah stood silently to the side, her hand on Baron's lead, her eyes moving from Emma to her parents to the judge. She had trusted the judge's instinct in bringing Baron into the courtroom, and now she was seeing the wisdom of that decision play out in real time. 15 minutes passed, then 20. During all of this time, the legal proceedings had paused. No arguments were being made. No evidence was being presented. The courtroom was simply watching a 3-year-old girl and a German Shepherd police dog share a moment of genuine connection. Emma reached out her small hand, extending it slowly, carefully, as if she was afraid that any sudden movement might make Baron disappear. Her fingers extended into the air, trembling slightly with a mixture of fear and hope. Baron turned his head gently, allowing the small fingers to make contact with his soft fur. The moment they touched, Emma's face transformed completely. The anxiety that had defined her entire morning dissolved in an instant. She began to gently stroke the dog's coat, her movements becoming more confident with each passing second. This was the moment that would change everything. No one in that courtroom, not the lawyers, not the judge, not the parents, could have predicted it or prepared for it. But they were all witnessing something profound. A child finding safety, finding comfort, finding a bridge back to her own sense of self in the gentle presence of a dog. The silence in the courtroom had become almost sacred, as if everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that transcended the usual rules of legal proceedings. Judge Henderson made no move to resume the formal proceedings. The court stenographer had stopped typing. Even the bailiff, who had seen countless courtroom dramas unfold over his career, stood completely still, mesmerized by what was happening before his eyes. Emma continued to stroke Baron's fur, her small fingers moving across his thick coat in gentle, repetitive motions. With each stroke, her breathing became deeper, slower, more controlled. The tension that had been visible in every line of her small body began to melt away like ice on a spring day. Her face, which had been pale and drawn just moments before, began to flush with a healthy color. More importantly, the fear that had been reflected in her eyes seemed to evaporate, replaced by something that looked remarkably like peace. Baron, for his part, was performing exactly as he had been trained. The German shepherd remained perfectly still, allowing the small child to touch him, to connect with him, to find whatever it was she needed through this physical contact. But there was something more happening here than just training. There was an instinctual understanding between dog and child, a recognition that transcended species and age. Baron somehow knew that this small human needed him, and he was giving her exactly what she needed: his presence, his calm, his steady and unwavering attention. Detective Sarah Mills watched from her position nearby, tears beginning to form in the corners of her eyes. In 5 years of working with Baron, she had seen him comfort grieving families, calm traumatized victims, and help frightened children. But she had never seen anything quite like this. This wasn't just Baron doing his job. This was Baron serving a higher purpose, becoming the bridge between a terrified child and the possibility of healing. Judge Henderson leaned forward slightly, observing the interaction with the careful attention of someone who understood that they were witnessing a crucial turning point. She had made her unconventional decision based on intuition and research, but seeing it play out in real time was something altogether different. The judge realized that sometimes, the most important moments in a courtroom happen not when legal arguments are presented, but when the masks come off and authentic human emotion is allowed to surface. Michael Carlson's hands, which had been gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, suddenly relaxed. He watched his daughter, really watched her, for what felt like the first time in months. He saw her as she truly was, not as a piece of property to be fought over, not as a symbol of his failed marriage, not as evidence in a legal case. He saw her as Emma, his daughter, a small, beautiful human being who deserved to have a father who was present, who was attentive, who was genuinely interested in her well-being. Something broke inside of Michael in that moment. It wasn't a dramatic breaking, not like something shattering or collapsing. It was more like a wall that he had built around his heart, brick by brick over months of fighting and anger and bitterness, suddenly developing a crack. Through that crack, light began to pour in, the light of his genuine love for his daughter, a love that had been obscured by his need to win. Patricia, watching Michael's face, felt her own defensive posture begin to crack as well. She had positioned herself as his ally, his supporter, his partner in this custody battle. She had encouraged him to fight harder, to present the strongest case possible, to prove that he was the better parent. But now, seeing his genuine love and concern for Emma, Patricia had to confront a difficult truth. She had perhaps encouraged him down a path that was taking him further away from his daughter, not closer to her. Catherine, on the other side of the courtroom, was experiencing her own profound moment of realization. She had fought so hard to protect Emma, to keep her away from Michael and Patricia, but had she been truly present during the fight? Had she spent quality time with her daughter, or had she been consumed by her own anger and betrayal? Watching Emma now, peaceful and calm in the presence of a dog, Catherine realized that her daughter had been struggling to find this kind of peace, this kind of safety, throughout their entire custody battle. And Catherine hadn't been able to provide it because she herself had been too caught up in the war. Emma looked up from Baron for the first time in several minutes, and her eyes found her father. Michael's heart stopped. He had expected to see anger in her eyes, or fear, or the withdrawn sadness that had become so familiar. Instead, he saw something that cut through him like a knife. He saw his daughter looking at him with hope, with a tentative reaching out, with a desperate wish that perhaps he might be the kind of father who could give her what Baron was giving her right now. But Emma didn't speak. Instead, she turned back to Baron and continued stroking his fur, whispering something that only the dog could hear. Sarah, standing nearby, could barely make out the words. "You're nice," Emma whispered. "You're here, you stay." Those simple words hung in the air like a confession, like a truth that a 3-year-old child understood more clearly than all the lawyers and judges and expert witnesses in the room. Emma was telling Baron what she needed, what she wanted, what she had been asking for all along. She wanted someone to be nice to her, to be truly present with her, to stay with her. Judge Henderson watched this unfold and understood that she was witnessing something that no legal precedent could adequately address. This wasn't about whether Michael or Catherine was the better parent. This was about what Emma needed, and what she needed was for both of her parents to show up for her the way Baron was showing up for her right now. The judge made a silent decision in that moment. The traditional legal arguments would continue, the evidence would be presented, the expert witnesses would testify. But the real verdict in this case had already been delivered by a 3-year-old girl and a German Shepherd police dog. Sarah gently placed her hand on Baron's shoulder, a signal that it was time to begin wrapping up the interaction. But she did so slowly, carefully, understanding the importance of this moment being allowed to conclude naturally rather than being abruptly ended. Emma realized what was happening and tightened her grip on Baron's fur, not violently but with a desperate kind of urgency. "No," she said softly. "No, don't go." "Emma," Sarah said gently, "Baron needs to rest, but he'll always remember you, and you'll always remember him, right?" Emma nodded slowly, reluctantly releasing her grip on the dog's fur. Baron turned his head and licked her face once, gently, a benediction of sorts. Then, with Sarah's guidance, he began to stand, his large frame unfolding from the floor. As Baron and Sarah moved toward the back of the courtroom, Emma's eyes followed them. But something had changed. The fear was gone. In its place was something that looked like resilience, like the beginning of understanding that there was kindness in the world, that there were beings who could be present and gentle and good. Judge Henderson finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I think we all need to take a substantial recess. When we reconvene, I want to speak with both parents separately. Court is recessed." She banged her gavel once, a sound that seemed to echo through the courtroom like a bell tolling the end of one era and the beginning of another. The courtroom had resumed after the recess, though the atmosphere had shifted fundamentally. It was no longer a place of combat and legal maneuvering. It had become something more akin to a sacred space where important truths were about to be revealed. Judge Henderson sat at her bench, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharp and attentive. Both Michael and Catherine had returned to their respective tables, but the energy between them was different now. The anger seemed to have drained out, replaced by something more vulnerable and raw. Emma sat in her specially prepared chair, Mr. Button still clutched in her hand. The encounter with Barron had fundamentally altered something within her. She was calmer now, more present, more herself. The rigid fear that had characterized her entire morning had been replaced by something more settled, more grounded. She had experienced kindness and presence in its purest form, and that experience had opened something inside her that had been closed before. Detective Sarah Mills stood with Barron at the back of the courtroom, having been instructed by Judge Henderson to remain present. The judge had explained that she might need the dog again, and Sarah had agreed without hesitation. She could feel the significance of this moment, the weight of what was about to happen. Barron remained calm and attentive, his body relaxed but his eyes alert, as if he too understood the gravity of the proceedings. Judge Henderson made an unprecedented decision. She called for Emma to be brought closer to the bench, not in an interrogative way, but as if the judge simply wanted to have a conversation with the small child. Susan Matthews, the court-appointed guardian ad litem, guided Emma forward gently, and the little girl walked on unsteady legs toward the judge's elevated position. "Emma," Judge Henderson said softly, her voice gentle and warm, entirely different from the formal tone she had used throughout the morning's legal arguments. "I want you to look around this room. Do you see everyone here?" Emma's eyes moved slowly around the courtroom, taking in the faces of the lawyers, the bailiff, the court stenographer, and finally landing on her two parents. She nodded slowly, not quite understanding the question, but sensing that the judge was asking her something important. "Emma, I need you to tell me something," Judge Henderson continued. "And I want you to be very honest with me. There's no wrong answer. I just want to know what you're thinking. Okay?" Emma nodded again, her small chin trembling slightly. "Do you remember the dog?" the judge asked. "Barron." Emma's face lit up immediately. She nodded vigorously, and for the first time, a genuine smile appeared on her small face. She reached up with her hand, mimicking the stroking motion she had been making on Barron's fur. "Yes," Emma said clearly, "good dog." "He is a good dog," Judge Henderson agreed. "And do you know why he's such a good dog, Emma?" Emma shook her head, her eyes still bright with the memory of her interaction with Barron. "Because he was here," the judge explained gently. "He was present with you, he was kind to you, he listened to you. Do you understand?" Emma seemed to consider this, her small brow furrowing slightly as she worked through the concept. Then Judge Henderson asked the question that would change everything. "Emma, if your daddy was more like Barron, would you be happy?" The courtroom fell absolutely silent. Not a single person moved. Not a single person breathed. Everyone understood that this was the moment, the crucial pivot point upon which the entire case would turn. Emma looked toward her father. Michael's hands were shaking, and his face had gone pale. He knew what was coming, though he didn't yet know exactly what his daughter would say. He just knew, with the certainty of absolute terror, that his daughter was about to deliver a judgment that would cut through all his legal arguments and expert witnesses and carefully constructed case. Emma's small finger extended and pointed directly at her father. Her voice was clear, certain, and utterly devastating. "Daddy home." Michael's breath caught in his throat. Tears began to stream down his face before his daughter had even finished speaking. Then Emma added, in a voice that was barely louder than a whisper, but that seemed to echo through the entire courtroom with the force of thunder, "Daddy nice." The moment the words left Emma's mouth, time seemed to stop. Michael Carlson stood up abruptly, so suddenly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. His face was completely crumpled, his body convulsing with sobs that seemed to come from a place deep within his soul. He stood there for a moment, staring at his daughter, and then he bolted from the courtroom without saying a word to anyone. Rachel Hoffman, his attorney, immediately stood up to follow him, but Judge Henderson held up her hand. "Let him go," the judge said quietly. "He needs to be alone right now." The sound of Michael's footsteps echoing down the hallway seemed to punctuate what Emma had just said. The message was clear, unmistakable, and devastating in its simplicity. His daughter didn't need him to win a custody battle. She needed him to be home. She needed him to be nice. Patricia Monroe sat absolutely still, her face drained of all color. She realized in that moment that she had been complicit in pulling Michael away from his daughter. She had encouraged him to fight, to present himself as the strong protector, to prove that he was better than Catherine. But in doing so, they had moved further and further away from what Emma actually needed. Patricia understood now that she had been an obstacle between a father and his daughter, and that realization was crushing. Catherine had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. But her tears were not tears of victory or vindication. They were tears of sorrow, because she too had been so consumed by the battle that she had failed to truly be present for her daughter. Emma's words weren't just a judgment against Michael. They were an indictment of both parents for losing sight of what actually mattered. Judge Henderson gently guided Emma back to her chair. The little girl didn't seem to understand the magnitude of what she had just said. She was still smiling, still thinking about Barron, still basking in the afterglow of the kindness she had experienced. "Would you like to see Barron again?" Judge Henderson asked gently. Emma nodded enthusiastically, and the judge signaled for Sarah to bring the dog forward. Barron walked up to Emma, and without any prompting, the dog lowered his head and allowed the small child to wrap her arms around him. Emma hugged the dog with the intensity of someone who had found an anchor in a storm, and Barron stood perfectly still, accepting the embrace with the grace and dignity he had shown throughout this entire experience. Judge Henderson watched this interaction, and she made a silent vow to herself. This case would not end like so many others, with children damaged by parental conflict and caught in the wreckage of adult warfare. This case would end differently. This case would end with healing, with both parents understanding what their daughter truly needed, and with the recognition that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected sources. She banged her gavel once, firmly but not harshly. "Court is in recess for the remainder of the day. I will speak with both parents separately tomorrow morning. We will reconvene at 9 a.m. This hearing is not concluded, but an important shift has occurred. I suggest you all use this time to reflect on what you have witnessed today." As the bailiff moved to clear the courtroom, Emma continued to hold Barron, and the dog continued to stand perfectly still, his presence a testament to the power of simple, unconditional kindness to transform even the most broken situations. Michael Carlson's feet carried him mechanically down the corridor of the courthouse, his vision blurred by tears that seemed to come from an endless well. He wasn't conscious of where he was going or what he was doing. All he knew was that he needed to be away from the courtroom, away from the faces of everyone who had witnessed his daughter's brutal honesty, away from the reality of what she had just said. He found himself in a small consultation room on the second floor, the same room where he had met with Rachel Hoffman numerous times over the past 9 months to discuss strategy, to refine his arguments, to shore up his case. But today, the room felt different. Today, all those carefully prepared arguments seemed utterly meaningless, hollow shells of words that had been designed to win a legal battle, but had accomplished nothing except driving a wedge between him and his daughter. Michael collapsed into one of the chairs, his body folding in on itself as sobs racked his entire frame. His shoulders shook uncontrollably, and his breathing became ragged and desperate. He had cried before in his life, of course, but never like this. Never with this kind of profound, soul-deep despair. Never with the certain knowledge that he had failed at the most important thing in his life. He thought about the past 9 months. He thought about the moment when Catherine had first told him that she was filing for full custody, claiming that Patricia was a bad influence, that he wasn't spending enough time with Emma. At the time, he had been angry. Angry at Catherine for trying to take his daughter away from him. Angry at Patricia for existing in his life and providing Catherine ammunition for her accusations. But mostly, he had been too angry to really listen to what Catherine was saying. The truth was, and this truth crashed down on him like a tidal wave in this small consultation room, he hadn't been spending time with Emma. Real time. quality time. When she came to visit, he was preoccupied, thinking about work, thinking about Patricia, thinking about the custody case. He would hand Emma off to Patricia while he reviewed legal documents or took phone calls or simply checked out mentally from the reality of his daughter's presence. He remembered the last time Emma had come to visit him, maybe 2 weeks ago. She had wanted to play with him, to build something with blocks, to have him read her a story. But he had been tense that day, worried about the upcoming custody hearing, rehearsing arguments in his head about why Catherine was an inadequate mother. When Emma had asked him to play, he had done it, but his mind had been elsewhere. She had sensed it. Of course she had sensed it, because children are far more perceptive than adults give them credit for. She had eventually given up and gone to sit by herself, hugging Mr. Buttons and watching him with sad eyes. Michael put his head in his hands and wept, not for the custody case, not for the money he had spent on lawyers, not for his pride or his ego or his need to win. He wept for his daughter. He wept for the months he had lost with her, months that she would never get back. He wept for the little girl who had been asking him, through her sadness and her fear and her withdrawn behavior, to simply be her father. Daddy home, daddy nice. Those two phrases kept echoing through his mind, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. Emma wasn't asking him to win a custody battle. She wasn't asking him to prove that Catherine was a bad mother. She wasn't asking him to defeat Patricia or to show that he was the better parent. Emma was asking for something far simpler and far more important. She was asking him to come home emotionally. She was asking him to be kind to her. She was asking him to show up. In another consultation room on the first floor, Patricia Monroe was experiencing her own reckoning, though it was of a different nature. She sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clenched into fists, her face pale and drawn. Unlike Michael, she was not crying. Instead, she was experiencing something that felt almost worse. She was experiencing clarity. Patricia had spent the past 9 months positioning herself as Michael's partner, his support, his cheerleader. She had encouraged him to fight harder, to prove his case, to show that he was the better parent. She had told herself that she was doing it because she cared about him, because she wanted to build a life with him, because she believed in their future together. But now, watching Michael's face as Emma had spoken, watching the way his entire body had crumpled under the weight of his daughter's honest observation, Patricia had to confront a difficult truth about herself. She had been selfish. She had encouraged Michael to prioritize their relationship over his relationship with his daughter. She had made comments, hurtful, careless comments, about Emma being difficult, about how much work it was to have her around on weekends, about how much better things would be when they had their own children together. Michael had repeated some of those comments to his lawyers, trying to paint Patricia as someone who didn't want Emma in their lives. Those comments had become evidence, ammunition in the courtroom battle. Patricia had sat through the hearing listening to her own words being used against her, and she had felt a kind of shame that was almost suffocating. But it wasn't until she watched Emma point at her father and ask him to be home and nice that Patricia truly understood what she had done. She had been an obstacle. She had been a barrier between a father and his daughter. She had encouraged him to build a fortress around themselves when what his daughter needed was for him to be open, present, and available. Patricia thought about Michael's face as he had listened to Emma speak. She had seen genuine love there, genuine concern, genuine devastation at his own failures. And she realized that Michael was capable of being the kind of father Emma needed. But she had been pulling him in the opposite direction, making it harder for him to be present, making it easier for him to justify his emotional absence. Across the courthouse, in yet another small room, Catherine sat with her attorney, David Chen. But unlike Michael and Patricia, Catherine didn't need to be told what had happened or what it meant. She already knew. She had known for months, on some deep level, that something was terribly wrong with the way she had been handling this situation. Catherine had fought so hard to protect Emma, but in doing so, she had failed to truly nurture her. She had been so consumed with the custody battle, with proving that she was the better parent, with protecting her daughter from Michael's alleged failures, that she had forgotten to simply be a mother. She had been a warrior in a legal battle instead of a nurturer in her daughter's life. Watching Emma with Baron had been enlightening. Catherine had seen her daughter relax, smile, find peace in the presence of a calm, kind being who simply showed up without judgment or agenda. That was what Emma needed from both her parents: presence without judgment, kindness without conditions, the simple act of showing up. Catherine realized that even if she won full custody, even if the court ruled entirely in her favor, she would still be failing Emma if she couldn't learn to be the kind of mother her daughter needed. Emma's words, "Daddy home, Daddy nice," weren't just directed at her father. They were a message to both parents about what truly mattered. Judge Henderson, sitting in her chambers, was reviewing the notes she had taken during the proceedings. She had written only 4 words after Emma spoke: "The truth has been spoken." She understood now that her decision to bring Baron into the courtroom had been absolutely right. Sometimes, the legal system got in the way of justice. Sometimes, the presentation of facts and evidence and expert testimony obscured what really mattered. Sometimes, it took a dog and a 3-year-old child to cut through all the noise and reveal the essential truth: that what children need is not a perfect parent fighting to prove themselves in court, but an imperfect parent willing to show up, to be present, and to be kind. Tomorrow morning, when she spoke with Michael and Catherine separately, she would present them with a choice. They could continue fighting each other, or they could start fighting for their daughter. The choice, Judge Henderson knew, would define not just this case, but the rest of Emma's childhood. The morning sun cast long shadows across Judge Henderson's chambers as she sat at her desk, reviewing the files one final time before calling both parents in for their separate consultations. She had barely slept the night before, her mind churning through the events of the previous day, replaying Emma's words over and over, and contemplating the most important decision she would make in this case. She had spent 30 years in the legal profession, 17 of them on the bench, and she had learned that the law was both a precise instrument and a blunt tool. It could protect people, establish boundaries, enforce rights. But it could also damage people, create adversaries out of family members, and prioritize winning over well-being. In this case, she was determined to wield the law in service of healing rather than destruction. Michael Carlson arrived at 8:30 a.m., 15 minutes before his scheduled appointment. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face unshaven, his expensive suit wrinkled and disheveled. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, who had been wrestling with demons through the long hours of darkness. When he sat across from Judge Henderson's desk, he didn't wait for her to speak. Instead, he immediately began. "Your Honor, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice hoarse from crying. "Everything I've been fighting for in this custody case. I've been fighting for the wrong things. My daughter pointed at a dog yesterday and told me what she needed, and I finally heard her. I heard her clearly for the first time in months." Judge Henderson listened carefully, not interrupting, allowing Michael to continue. "I haven't been present in Emma's life," Michael continued. "I've been so focused on winning this case, on proving that I'm the better parent, that I've forgotten to actually be her father. Patricia has been encouraging me down that path, and I've let her. But Emma doesn't need me to win a legal battle. She needs me to come home emotionally. She needs me to be kind to her. She needs me to show up." The judge nodded slowly. "Mr. Carlson, I appreciate your honesty. That takes courage. But I need to ask you something important. Are you saying this because you genuinely understand what your daughter needs, or are you saying this because you're afraid of how the court will rule?" Michael flinched at the directness of the question, but he didn't look away. "Both, Your Honor. I'm not going to lie to you and say that fear isn't part of this, but more than that. Watching Emma yesterday, seeing her find peace with that dog, understanding that she was asking me to be like that dog, present, kind, steady, something changed in me. It wasn't an intellectual change. It was a deep, soul-level change." Judge Henderson studied him carefully, and something in her expression softened. She had learned to distinguish between manipulation and genuine transformation, and she believed she was seeing the latter. "I'm ordering you into family therapy," she said firmly. "Not as punishment, but as a tool for genuine change. If you're serious about becoming the kind of father Emma needs, you're going to need professional support. You've spent 9 months fighting against Catherine and supporting Patricia. It's time you spent 9 months fighting for Emma and supporting her emotional well-being. Do you understand?" Michael nodded emphatically. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand." When Catherine arrived 30 minutes later, her demeanor was different from Michael's. She was composed, though there was a brittleness to that composure, as if she might shatter at any moment. She sat down across from the judge, and Judge Henderson began without preamble. "Your daughter's words yesterday were not a victory for you, Ms. Carlson," the judge said directly. "Yes, she was expressing her needs for her father, but her needs are not limited to him. She needs you to be present as well, to be available, to be nurturing. Throughout this custody battle, you have been so focused on protecting your daughter from her father that you haven't always been focused on simply being her mother. Is that a fair assessment?" Catherine's face crumpled and tears began to stream down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "That's fair. I've been so angry, so determined to prove that Michael was failing her, that I've failed her in a different way. I've been fighting a battle instead of nurturing my daughter." "Then we're going to address that," Judge Henderson said. "You will also enter family therapy with the same goal, learning to be the mother your daughter needs. Not the mother who fights custody battles, not the mother who proves points against her ex-husband, but the mother who shows up every single day, present and available and kind." By the time both parents had left her chambers, Judge Henderson had made her final decision. She called her clerk and instructed him to notify all parties that the court would reconvene at 2 p.m. for the ruling. The courtroom was packed that afternoon. Word had gotten out about the unusual nature of the proceedings, and several journalists had arrived, sensing that this case was about to produce a verdict that would be newsworthy. Both Michael and Catherine sat at their respective tables, their attorneys beside them, though the attorneys looked somewhat confused about what was about to happen. This case had taken a turn that they had not anticipated. Emma was not in the courtroom for the ruling. Judge Henderson had specifically requested that the child be kept away, understanding that the ruling was not about her, but about her parents. Judge Henderson took her seat at the bench and looked out across the courtroom. There was a gravity to her expression that commanded absolute attention. "This custody case has been one of the most unusual cases I have presided over in my 17 years on the bench," she began. "Not because of the legal arguments, which have been competent on both sides, not because of the evidence, which has been presented clearly, but because both parents have lost sight of the most important element of this case, the well-being of their 3-year-old daughter." She paused, letting that statement hang in the air. "Yesterday, Detective Mills brought a police dog into my courtroom, and that dog did something that no expert witness, no legal argument, and no presentation of evidence could do. That dog reminded all of us what truly matters. Emma Carlson asked her father to be home and to be nice. This request should have been the foundation of this entire case, and yet it took a dog to help us all hear it." Judge Henderson adjusted her glasses and continued. "I am now issuing my ruling. This case is being restructured from a traditional custody battle into a family healing process. I am ordering joint custody on a 50-50 basis, with both parents having equal responsibility and equal time with Emma Carlson. However, this arrangement is contingent on the following conditions." She paused dramatically. "Both parents will immediately begin family therapy with a therapist of my choosing, someone who specializes in co-parenting and childhood trauma. Both parents will complete a parenting course, not as punishment, but as an opportunity for growth and education. Both parents will demonstrate, through their actions and through monthly check-ins with my office, that they are committed to genuine co-parenting that prioritizes Emma's emotional well-being over their own desires to win." Judge Henderson leaned forward, her eyes moving between Michael and Catherine. "I want to be clear about something. If either of you attempts to use Emma as a pawn, if either of you speaks negatively about the other parent to your daughter, if either of you fails to show up emotionally and physically for your child, we will reconvene and I will revisit this arrangement. There are consequences for failing to take this opportunity seriously." She paused once more, her expression softening slightly. "But I also want to say something else. I believe that both of you love your daughter. I believe that both of you have the capacity to be the parents she deserves. What you need is support, guidance, and a fundamental shift in how you view this situation. You are not competitors for a prize. You are partners in raising a human being. That human being needs both of you, and she needs both of you to be present and kind." Judge Henderson banged her gavel once, firmly but not harshly. "This ruling is effective immediately. You will each receive a copy of the custody schedule, the therapy requirements, and the parenting course information. Your first therapy sessions must be scheduled within 1 week. Court is adjourned." As the gavel echoed through the courtroom, something shifted in the air. This wasn't a victory for either parent, but it was something far more important. It was an opportunity for redemption, a chance for both Michael and Catherine to become the parents their daughter deserved, and a recognition that sometimes the most important rulings in a courtroom are not about determining winners and losers, but about creating the conditions for healing. Michael looked across at Catherine, and for the first time in 9 months, there was no anger in his expression. There was only a shared understanding, a mutual recognition that they had both been failing their daughter in different ways, and that they both had the opportunity to change. Detective Sarah Mills was sitting at her desk at the Cincinnati Police Department, reviewing case files and updating reports, when she noticed an envelope on her desk. It was addressed to her in careful handwriting, the return address simply reading MC with no other identifying information. She recognized the postmark immediately. It was local, sent from Cincinnati just 3 days ago. Sarah opened the envelope carefully, and a handwritten letter fell into her lap. She adjusted her reading glasses and began to read, tears forming in her eyes before she had even reached the end of the first paragraph. "Detective Mills," the letter began, "I'm writing to you because I wanted to thank you for something that changed my life. 6 months ago, you brought your dog Baron into Judge Henderson's courtroom, and that decision, which I'm sure seemed unconventional at the time, set off a chain of events that has fundamentally altered my relationship with my daughter and with my ex-wife. When Emma pointed at Baron and asked me to be daddy home and daddy nice, something broke open inside of me. It wasn't a destruction, but a cracking open of walls I had built around my heart. For 9 months, I had been so consumed with winning a custody battle that I had lost sight of why I wanted custody in the first place. I wanted to be with my daughter because I love her. That's it. That's all that mattered. I've spent the past 6 months in therapy, learning how to be present with Emma in a way that I wasn't capable of before. Judge Henderson ordered me to attend parenting classes, and I resisted initially, thinking I knew how to be a parent. But those classes taught me that being a parent isn't about being right or about proving something. It's about showing up, day after day, and being kind even when you're frustrated, even when you're tired, even when you don't have all the answers. The most remarkable thing has happened, Detective Mills. My ex-wife Catherine and I have become something we never were before, genuine partners in raising our daughter. We're not back together romantically, and I don't think we ever will be. But we respect each other now in a way that we didn't even when we were married. We've both committed to never speaking negatively about each other to Emma, and more importantly, we've both committed to being the best versions of ourselves when we're with her. Patricia, my fiancée, took some time to reflect during those 6 months as well. She realized that she had been encouraging me down a path that was taking me further away from my daughter rather than closer to her. Patricia and I broke up about 3 months ago, amicably. It wasn't that we didn't care about each other, but we both understood that she was an obstacle to my relationship with Emma, and neither of us could continue being part of that dynamic. Emma has thrived these past 6 months. She spends half her time with Catherine and half with me, and she's learned to trust that both of us will show up for her, consistently and kindly. She still asks about Baron sometimes. Last week, she drew a picture of him and wrote "Good Dog" underneath in her own clumsy letters. I framed it and hung it on my refrigerator, and every time I look at it, I'm reminded of what Baron taught me, that presence and kindness are more powerful than any legal victory. I wanted you to know the impact of what you did that day. I wanted you to know that Baron didn't just calm a frightened child in a courtroom. He saved a family. He saved my relationship with my daughter. He taught me what truly matters. Thank you, Detective Mills. Tell Baron he's a hero. Sincerely, Michael Carlson. Sarah sat at her desk for a long time after finishing the letter, her vision blurred by tears. She looked over at Baron, who was resting his head on his paws in his designated K9 unit area. The dog's eyes opened slightly, as if sensing her emotional state. "Did you hear that, buddy?" she said softly. "You saved a family." That same afternoon, Sarah decided to make an unscheduled visit to Judge Henderson's chambers. She knew it was irregular, but she felt compelled to share what Michael had written. When she arrived, the judge was between appointments, and her clerk ushered Sarah in immediately. Judge Henderson read the letter carefully, taking her time, absorbing every word. When she finished, she looked up at Sarah with moisture in her own eyes. "This," she said, holding up the letter, "is why I became a judge. This is what justice really looks like. Not winning a case, not proving who's right and who's wrong, but creating the conditions for healing and transformation." The judge sat back in her chair, a small smile playing at her lips. "You know, when I made the decision to bring Baron into that courtroom, I was taking a risk. I was going against protocol, against conventional legal procedure. Some people thought I was crazy. I had colleagues tell me it was inappropriate, that it set a dangerous precedent, that it could be grounds for appeal." She paused, looking at Sarah directly. "But I knew something that day. I knew that law without compassion is just bureaucracy. I knew that sometimes the most important moments in a courtroom happen not when legal arguments are made, but when human hearts are opened. And I knew that a 3-year-old child and a police dog could accomplish what no expert witness or legal precedent could." Judge Henderson walked over to her filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. She opened it and showed Sarah what was inside: Michael's letter, carefully preserved in a protective sleeve. "I framed it," the judge said. "It's going on the wall of my chambers. It's going to remind me, every single day for the rest of my career, that justice isn't about determining winners and losers. It's about creating the conditions for people to become better versions of themselves." Over the following weeks, Sarah received additional communications about the impact of that day. Catherine sent her a brief note thanking her, mentioning that she had also begun therapy and that she had learned to appreciate Michael as a co-parent. She wrote about how Emma had flourished in the past 6 months, how the child seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by the tension between her parents. Emma's teacher sent a note mentioning that the little girl had become more confident, more open, more willing to engage with other children and adults. The teacher attributed the change to increased emotional stability at home and mentioned that Emma often talked about the nice dog who had helped her feel better. Sarah kept all of these letters and notes, and she began to understand the full scope of what had happened that day in the courtroom. Baron hadn't just calmed a frightened child. He had been the catalyst for a profound transformation that had rippled through an entire family system. 5 years later, when Baron was reaching the end of his career as a police dog, Sarah made the decision to retire him to a peaceful life of leisure. But before she did, she took him to visit Judge Henderson one final time. The judge was moved to tears seeing the dog that had become, in the eyes of many in Cincinnati, a true hero. "Baron," Judge Henderson said, kneeling down to stroke the dog's fur, You've taught more people about justice, compassion, and the true meaning of family than I've learned in all my years in law school. Thank you for that." Emma Carlson, now 8 years old, had learned to read well enough to understand the story of what had happened that day in the courtroom when she was 3. Her mother had kept the newspaper clippings, had saved the letters, had preserved the memory of that pivotal moment. Emma understood, in the way that children do, that a dog had helped save her family. Years later, when asked about her childhood, Emma would describe the chaos of the custody battle and the confusion it had caused her. But she would also describe the moment when a kind dog had shown her what she needed to ask for. She would describe how both her parents, in their own ways, had answered that request by learning to be present and kind. Judge Henderson's decision in the Carlson case became something of a legend in legal circles. It was discussed in law school classes as an example of how judges could use unconventional methods to achieve genuine justice. Some legal scholars praised it as innovative and compassionate. Others criticized it as inappropriate and potentially precedent-setting in problematic ways. But for Michael, Catherine, and Emma Carlson, the case was simply the moment when everything changed. It was the moment when a 3-year-old girl pointed at a dog and asked for "Daddy home" and "Daddy nice," and in doing so, revealed a truth that no legal argument could obscure, that what families need is not perfect parents fighting perfect battles, but imperfect human beings willing to show up, be present, and be kind. And Baron, the German Shepherd police dog, became the unlikely hero of a story that proved, once and for all, that sometimes the most powerful voices in a courtroom belong not to lawyers or judges, but to children and dogs who understand, on a level deeper than words, what truly matters.